hopefully. All right, so we've spent a little bit of time in chapter 1 and chapter 2 kind of discussing, first off, what is risk? And the second was, well, how can we measure risk? And in that, we actually talk about like pooling and insurance and all that. But what we really haven't nailed down just yet is what we mean by risk management. Sure, we've had some phrases like, well, let's mitigate this risk, let's try to reduce this risk. Well, we know how to measure it, and we know certain things like pooling does help reduce risk, at least as we measure it and we like to discuss it. But how can we manage risk maybe from a corporate level or a firm level? So what we need is a more formalized way to deal with these risks. So when we talk about risk management, the first step is to formalize it. We can't just say, oh, well, we're going to manage this risk. We're going to lower deviation or lower some volatility, right? So that's not really as clean cut as we would like it to be. So we have this formal decision-making process to address risk. And when we're talking about from an enterprise perspective, it's mostly that kind of our exposure, our losses are more focused on the financial burdens or impacts of those risks. You can risk, you can manage your risk at a personal level, sure. But as we said in previous chapters, our focus is going to be more on objective risk here. Okay, so more objective risk. So this usually kind of focuses on like looking at those, again, those loss exposures and figuring out how we best deal with them and how we best deal with them. And a quick reminder here, we've already had this, but just a quick reminder, we'll say that loss exposures, for this case, any item or event in which we could see a loss or experience a loss. Okay, it might not necessarily be tangible. We talked about indirect loss, like loss of business income, right? So it might not be a specific item, a situation or item. Just again, that's a reminder. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to spend a lot of our time going over these 4 steps here. Going over these 4 steps here. We'll talk about how we can assess or identify our losses, how we can measure, so this is the evaluation, and then kind of how we deal with that and update how we deal with it. Okay, so select and implement respectively. So how do we figure out our risk? Okay, that needs to be the first kind of step. If we just throw our hands in the air, we're done with it, or just ignore it, that doesn't make the risk go away. Doesn't mean we're dealing with it at all. A couple of ways here that we can do this. We can ask employees, we can have questionnaires. Just because we have a top level manager doesn't mean that he or she knows everything about the firm. Every employee probably knows something very specific, some idiosyncratic knowledge about the firm that another employee might not be privy to. We can look at physical inspections, especially if we're thinking about kind of a pure loss standpoint. So from a pure loss standpoint, physical inspections. That could lead to liability. So if you've ever noticed in many buildings, as you're moving up steps, there'll be some way to delineate each step. Usually it's, it could be a rubber bumper, it could be that it's a bright color. What's a liability issue? You want people to be able to see each step. But that's a physical inspection that made us aware of the liability. Okay? Not that liability can't be physical damage either, but flow charts, this lets us see the interconnectedness of each functional unit of business. Then, of course, financial statements are very good for us. If we're thinking about kind of outside of just pure losses, more speculative losses, where are we holding our assets? Who do we owe money to? We can also use historical data and time trends. Now, let's move into evaluating losses, because this is important. What we've done up until now is we've looked at averages and we've looked at deviation, and we kind of get this inkling that just averages are not good enough. But even if we just have one probability of loss or one severity of loss, they can give us that same average, but they're very different. Now we know this in a more formalized way by calculating standard deviation. But we really don't need that. We can compare here in the next slide 2 losses of the same expected value, but anyone could see that they should not be managed the same. So we don't need that kind of statistical tool set to be able to measure and understand that not all losses are the same, even if they're the same value. A way to think about this is car accidents happen about every 6 seconds in the United States. But per person, that it's far less. You may go years without suffering an automobile accident. Years. But because we have a high frequency of drivers, for the population as a whole, there are a large number of accidents. Okay. But per person, per capita, we could say, not so much. Right? Not so much. So it's not only in how you present it. So again, frequency here is how often. So that's probability. And severity here, financially, how much? Okay, what do we have to lose? With severity, we have kind of two ways we look at it. We can say, all right, what's the maximum possible loss? An example of that, say your personal automobile, we can look at it and say, all right, the market value is $20,000. So $20,000 is about your maximum possible loss, ignoring indirect losses, right? Because if your car is no longer working, then you can't get to work, or you can't get to class, but just the physical value of it. But what if we look at legal hazard or liability risk? We discussed that early on in the semester and said, well, it kind of has this very long tail if we look at severity, and there's no real actual limit. Your wages can be garnished, okay, or liens can be put on your wages. So it might be better to kind of create a distribution or estimation and say, all right, well, 95% of the time, the loss for this risk is less than, let's say, $20,000. So your maximum probable loss there at the 95th percentile would be $20,000. Right? So those are not necessarily the same. The maximum possible is literally what it says. What's the possible loss, the maximum possible loss? But we can't always identify that. Another example of how we should kind of think about managing these risks that are on the surface, very, very surface level may seem similar, but they're not. Let's say that we have this loss here. It happens 5,000 times a year. It's $1 every time. So the expected value of that loss is $5,000. That's the weighted average of it. We have another one once every 1,000 years, but it's $5 million. But the expected value of that is the same. All right, we shouldn't treat that in the same way. We should not address these risks in the same way. But what's a good tool or heuristic to use? Well, one is the risk management matrix. So this would be something this would make an excellent short answer discussion question, FYI. To maybe give a brief definition of each of these 4 quadrants, and maybe provide one example that would fit in retention, control, transfer, or avoid. So for your future reference. But all we've done here, we have this very simple 2-dimensional matrix, which we've mapped out our 2 initial starting points when we assess risk, frequency, and severity. And we say, depending on where that loss exposure, well, the risk itself, where it may fall, we have this, again, nice little heuristic, a rule of thumb. It's not always right, not always perfect, but at least gives us a starting point. Okay, so we get a starting point here. So what are each of these? Okay, what are each of these? Let's go through them here quickly. So retention or retain, if it's something that does not occur that often and doesn't hit the business's books too hard, it's pretty infrequent, pretty low severity, we can pay for that out of pocket. We can pay for that out of pocket. So we're going to retain that loss. So it's retention. What if it's something that happens a little more frequently? Maybe in that last example, something that happens 1,000 times a year, that seems pretty frequent to me. That seems pretty frequent to me. But it's low severity, so maybe we should try to control that risk, which means that we'll either try to lower the severity or the frequency of it, either or. Now, maybe the other end of that when we had the 1 in 1,000 year, chance of $5 million. For some people, many people, in a good number of firms. So that's low frequency, pretty high severity. So we'd ideally want to transfer that risk to a firm or another entity that's in a stronger or more viable financial position to handle that. And then finally, we move to this last quadrant here, top right. This one is a bit peculiar to think about from a business perspective, because we always kind of have this baseline idea that with risk comes return. If we completely avoid a risk, in theory, we would net zero return. So if we want to completely avoid any risk as a firm, we just, shut up shop. We're not going to sell this product anymore, offer these services anymore. But that doesn't really make sense. So it's a little bit peculiar to think about how we would avoid certain risks. Okay? But how about let's go through a few examples to fit each of these. So let's say that we have a large-scale accounting firm. So a large-scale accounting firm. Something that they might want to retain could be petty theft. So their accountants, they won't steal, they might embezzle, they might be more aligned to do that. But, they accidentally take a pen, okay, whether they mean to take property or not. A few pens here and there, not too expensive, probably doesn't happen that often. We can retain those losses. We can buy new pens. It's fine. Let's say that there is some minor but very common accounting error that this firm might fall victim to, or their accountants might fall victim to. So it's minor, so low severity, but it's common, high frequency. That's something they want to control. Third example. Let's say that they're worried about director and officer malfeasance. So lawsuits of the director and officers saying things they shouldn't, could be harassment suits. They're very worried about that. Historically, has not happened for their firm, but when it does, it's very severe. So these are infrequent but costly. It may be that they want to purchase director and officers insurance, so D&O insurance. It exists. So if they lie to shareholders, if there's a lawsuit against them and then also the firm, they have insurance to cover that. So they've transferred that. Avoidance is a little more difficult, a little more tricky. So it could be that they, in the past, have had issues with helping firms that operate outside of the U.S. Either maybe they have been sued or they just don't really like, maybe they play fast and loose with a few laws here and there. So maybe this accounting firm wants to avoid other firms that maybe work outside of the U.S. Or it could be in a specific country. So they could do that. So they're avoiding that particular risk. And again, avoidance is a bit tricky to think about. I think the other three quadrants here, it's pretty easy to come up with some examples. I think the director and officer insurance is a really good one to think about. All right, so we've discussed each of those, and we'll come back to them a little bit later, and we've provided some examples that fit within each of these quadrants, which I think is a very good thing to do. Now, let's go back to risk control here, because I just kind of said, all right, we're just going to control the risk. Okay, well, but we want to do something to kind of reduce the frequency or severity of losses. So that's what we need. So we have the biggest, which is avoidance, very extreme case. If we avoid the risk, then we probably just say that it's not going to happen at all, so zero frequency, and also therefore zero severity. That's the extreme example. But I want you to know the difference here between prevention and reduction. So the difference between prevention and reduction. So prevention, the focus of prevention is to reduce the frequency. So think of like preventing it from happening. Preventing it from happening. And this is almost, a better way to think of this is it usually happens before the loss. I won't say always, but it usually happens before, right? Because we want to prevent. So that's focused on the frequency, or lowering the probability. Therefore, reduction here, and as a risk control technique, is reducing the severity. Reducing the severity. So like an example, if we're looking at Ball State and we say that the hazard is fire, okay? So buildings do sometimes, they burn down. So that's our student, the peril here. We're worried about fire. And let's say we're looking at just this room as far as exposure. If we have alarms, smoke detectors, or sprinkler systems, okay, talking about the damage, the property damage the fire can do. With a sprinkler system, to my knowledge, they usually don't kick in until after the fire, or at least the smoke, has started. So sprinklers are going to really reduce the severity. The fire's already kind of happening. We can say if it spreads to other rooms, sure, it's going to reduce prevention. But really the loss has already occurred. Okay? Or the event has already occurred. So really when we think about sprinklers, that might be an example where it reduces severity. It's after the fact. Prevention would be no smoking in the room, no smoking on campus. That's probably going to prevent some fires. If Ball State runs for 1,000,000 years, and you had another Ball State, a sister, university right beside it. They both run for 1,000,000 years. One says you can smoke on campus, the other one doesn't. Dollars to donuts, the one that lets people smoke on campus will have a few more fires. So the prevention is kind of prior to the loss. The reduction is on the severity, and it's often after the loss has already occurred. All right. Now, what if we do want to finance these losses? We're retaining, we're going to pay for it our own. We could say, we're going to just pay insurance for it too. But we want to retain these losses. Okay? So the best time to do this, so if it fits in that lower quadrant, it's not very common, it's not very severe, that's a good time to retain the losses. You can handle that. But sometimes you have to retain losses that might not fit in that lower quadrant. So if there's no other method available, sometimes you have to retain. Now, the retention level, that's just how much you're willing to pay out. So you could say, I'll retain up to $1 million of losses based on this exposure, and then I'd like to get insurance above that. So it'd be like, this is my deductible. Self-imposed, but it still works in a similar way. Now, another way that you can retain is by creating your own insurance company. You can say, I can't find anyone to take on this risk for me. The premiums are too high when I go to an insurance firm. So I'm going to make my own insurance company. Pay them premiums that are tax deductible for me, and then they'll cover my losses with those premiums I'm paying in. And as they earn those premiums that I'm giving them, they can invest in them. But it's still an expense to me. So a captive insurer here is just an insurer owned by the parent firm. And I do have a video here. Probably good to watch that on your own time. That's kind of part of the online assignments here. And I give you some examples. But it's basically, I'm going to create my own insurance company. Now, some good things about captives. They can become a source of profit. Okay, so why would I create this? Let's say outside of a source of profit, why would I create this? I might not get insurance elsewhere. That's kind of where I started with this. Favorable regulatory environment. Okay, so a number of these are located in the Caribbean, lower tax rates. The cost may be lower. You still have to set the firm up. But any loading expense that you're paying, it's kind of coming back to you. You also might have better access to the reinsurance market. So reinsurance is essentially insurance for insurance companies. And then finally, again, could be a source of profit. All right. In this chapter, I have provided you pros and cons lists that I think are advantages and disadvantages that I think would be good to help you with studying. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of move through these, but these are here to kind of guide your studying in the future. Yeah, I thought it was pretty good when we're talking about each of these kind of ways to select and deal with these risks. Okay, so these are just for you. Okay, and your book doesn't really cut it down like this, so I kind of created these again, hopefully to help you. So that's why I'm here. But again, I'm going to gloss over it because I just figured I'd save you a little bit of time. Okay. Now, so what about insurance? So that would be, this could also work for transfer, right? So just because you transfer a risk doesn't mean it's actually insurance. It could be some other agreement. Okay. So it's really appropriate for those high severity but low frequency losses. You can think of this on a personal level too. So when you purchase auto insurance, it tends to be for larger damage, or we're talking about larger physical damage. A fender bender, a little scuff, you're not going to be able to use insurance for that. Or you could try, but it's probably not going to hit your deductible. Now, if we put on our risk manager shoes, so maybe they look a little bit nicer, put on our risk manager shoes, what should we keep in mind? So if you find yourself in a position and you're saying, well, theoretically, I guess firms shouldn't purchase insurance, they should be risk neutral, but they do. It happens. Sometimes you need it. Okay, there's numerous reasons why a firm may behave in a non-risk neutral way. But I'm a risk manager. How do I go about selecting a good insurance contract? Well, you could start with how strong is that insurer? We can look at S&Ps and Moody's. AM Best tends to be the best if we're looking at ratings and strength. What other advantages? Okay, so there are some kind of ancillary benefits that insurance often offers. It could be that they have some in-house risk management to help you. So they can provide you with risk management techniques because they know if they do that, it lowers your risk. So from an actuarial perspective, should lower your premiums if we're factoring in risk correctly. So that's kind of a win-win. And you can always, kind of do a standard cost benefits analysis. There are a few avenues there, just in the future. And when you talk about corporate risk management, beyond this class, then that comes back up again, obviously. You also may have a little room to negotiate. So if you're going out looking for a personal auto policy or homeowners or renters, probably for most of you, you're not going to have a lot of leverage to negotiate. You might have room to shop around, but negotiations are pretty difficult. However, with larger firms, it's common that you could negotiate. If you're large enough, you have a little sway. Now, something that I mentioned here, and we'll get back to it when we talk about the implemented monitor, is that a good risk manager knows that risks are not dynamic. Excuse me. Risks are dynamic, they are not static. The very opposite of what I just said. So let's back up. Risks are not static. Risks are dynamic. I only had 2 cups of coffee today. Please forgive me. So risks are not static. They are dynamic. So you can't, let's say in this case, from just buying insurance, you can't buy an insurance contract, dust your hands off and be like, great, I'll renew it next year without changing anything. That is poor risk management. That's poor risk management. Again, have you a pros and cons list here that's for you to use in the future? Now, what about other ways to transfer risk? This is pretty short because you can really get into the weeds here. Examples of this would be, you guys have probably signed a lease. In your lease, you probably say to your landlord that you won't hold them responsible for certain things. So all these are types of contracts. Another example is a hold harmless agreement. So we have a couple of construction crews on Ball State, building some new structures for us. Great. It may be that when Ball State agreed to have, let's say, these contractors come out, build these buildings, it is likely that there was a hold harmless agreement saying that Ball State's not responsible should one of your workers be hurt on the job. There's other coverage for that if you're injured on the job. At workers' comp, disability. So Ball State, you would hold Ball State harmless. Again, a pros and cons list here. I think one thing I do want to mention here on the cons list or disadvantage. So an insurance company may not accept a non-insurance transfer as adequate coverage. So if you buy two insurance policies to cover the same risk, they might accept each other and say, all right, I'll cover their losses up to $1 million. The second insurer covers it from $1 million to $5 million. That might be all well and good. But with a contractual agreement like this, you might not have that. If you have a hold harmless agreement or some contract stating that I transfer up to $1 million of risk to this company, an insurance firm might not accept that. So I do want to mention that. Okay, and probably the Achilles heel to a risk management process comes in the implement and monitor. Mostly in the monitoring, which is to reassess periodically the strength of the risk management program in place. So the biggest weakness tends to fall in the implement and monitor. That's where we see the most failures. So do all your due diligence and homework leading up to that. We're going to transfer this risk, ensure that one, retain this, control that, and we'll just keep doing that forever. But the problem, again, is that risks are not static. Risks are dynamic. So you make sure that everyone is aware of this from the get-go. That's how you implement it. Again, this is what we're controlling. This is how we're controlling. This is our method of financing. We're going to create a captive. Let everyone know what's going on. As we see in the next chapter, we're going to implement a more enterprise-focused risk management system. It needs to spread just beyond the executives and just beyond one or two functional units of business. Okay. Questions about Chapter 3? Okay. All right. I'm going to stop this recording and separate the two.